A ship is lying on her side in the dark with nobody aboard. 164 meters of steel, heeled 40 degrees, engine dead. Helicopters lifted all 22 crew off in hours. Then the empty hull drifted east for 6 days at 3 knots, straight at France. This is the Bay of Biscay, the pocket between Brittany and Galicia, that every ship going south from northern Europe must cross. The easy answer is depth. It is the last shallow shelf after 3,000 miles of Atlantic. That explains the waves, not the corner. 1870, 1878, 1999, 2002, 2010, 2016. Look at the shape of it on a chart, and the first thing you notice is that it is not a bay at all. A bay implies shelter. This is a right angle cut into the corner of a continent, and both of its walls are rock. The northern wall runs west from the mouth of the Loire, out along the Brittany Peninsula to the island of Ushant. Then the coast turns hard south at the Pointe de Penmarche. The eastern wall runs almost straight down the French coast, past the Gironde estuary, past Arcachon, past the low sand and pine of the Landes, until it reaches the French-Spanish border near Hendaye. Then the whole thing turns west again and becomes the north coast of Spain. Basque Country, Cantabria, Asturias, Galicia, running for 400 kilometers to Cape Ortegal, and finally to Cape Finisterre, the corner of Europe that the Romans named the end of the earth because they could not imagine anything beyond it. Draw a line from Ushant to Cape Ortegal, and you have closed the box. Everything inside that line is the Bay of Biscay. It is open on exactly one side, and that side faces west, into the North Atlantic, into the direction the weather comes from. That is the whole problem, stated in one sentence, and it takes the rest of this story to unpack what it means. Start with what is underneath. In the middle of the bay, out where the water is deepest, the seabed is a flat plain of sediment, lying about 4,700 meters down. 4,700 meters. If you dropped Mont Blanc into it, the summit would still be more than a kilometer underwater. That plain is genuinely abyssal. Cold, dark, almost featureless. Part of the same deep ocean floor that runs west toward the mid-Atlantic ridge. Now walk east across it. For hundreds of kilometers, the depth barely changes. Then, in the space of a few tens of kilometers, the floor climbs. It climbs 4 kilometers. Above that climb sits the continental shelf. The Armorican Shelf off Brittany, the Aquitaine Shelf off the Landes coast, where the water is suddenly less than 200 meters deep and often much less than that. Off the French coast, the shelf is wide. 150 kilometers of shallow ground before the drop. Off the Spanish coast, it is narrow, sometimes only 12 to 30 kilometers, so the deep water comes almost to the beach. A swell rolling in from the open Atlantic does not care about any of this until it reaches that climb. Out in deep water, a swell is a long, low, slow-moving thing. Its energy is not on the surface. It extends down into the water column, hundreds of meters of moving water beneath every crest. A ship in deep Atlantic swell rises and falls, and rarely feels threatened. The wavelength is long, the crests are far apart, and the hull has time to recover between them. Then the seabed rises underneath it, and every one of those properties changes at once. When a wave's orbital motion starts to feel the bottom, the wave slows. The energy in it has to go somewhere, and the only direction left is up. The crest rises. The wavelength shortens. The face steepens. What was a long, gentle hill of water becomes a shorter, taller, harder wall of water, and it becomes that in a distance measured in kilometers rather than hundreds of kilometers. The same amount of energy is now packed into less horizontal space, so it hits harder and it hits more often. That is the difference between an ocean wave and a Biscay wave. and it is not a subtlety. It is the difference between a ship rising over something and a ship being struck by something. The spacing matters more than most people realize. Take a vessel in a long, deep water swell with 15 seconds between crests. She lifts, she rolls, the water drains off her deck, her hull settles, and by the time the next crest arrives, she is level again, and her stability is back to normal. Shorten that interval to 8 seconds, and she is still recovering from the last impact when the next one lands. She takes water aboard before the previous water has cleared. She is rolled while she is already rolling. Every impact starts from a worse position than the one before. The waves have not necessarily got bigger. They have got closer together, and closer together is worse. Where does the energy come from in the first place? Fetch. The distance of open water over which a wind can blow without interruption. A gale blowing across a lake makes a chop because the wind runs out of water. A gale blowing across the North Atlantic has 3,000 miles to work with, and it does not just make waves. It makes them, then keeps feeding them, then organizes them. The disturbed water sorts itself as it travels, the longer waves outrunning the shorter ones, so that what arrives at the far side is not a mess, but a train. Regular, long-period swell rolling in from the west and northwest, carrying the energy of a storm that may be 1,000 miles away and already dying. That swell arrives at the Bay of Biscay having crossed the entire ocean without touching anything. There is no shelter to the west. There is no landmass, no reef, no island chain to break it up. Greenland is too far north, the Azores too far south. The bay looks out along an unobstructed corridor of deep water, and it is aimed almost exactly at the region where Atlantic depressions intensify. So the bay receives long, powerful, fully developed swell, and then it does the shoaling to it. And the shoaling is what people actually experience. The numbers are unglamorous and worth translating. In winter, the significant wave height in the open bay commonly runs at 4 to 6 meters in an active weather pattern. Significant wave height is a statistical average of the largest third of the waves, which means that in a 6-meter sea, a substantial number of individual waves are 8 meters, and the occasional one is considerably more. Storms produce measured wave heights in the bay well into double figures. An 8-meter wave is a 3-story building arriving every 10 seconds. That is the crossing that everything else in this story happens in the middle of. If you have ever done it as a passenger, you already know its reputation. The ferry routes across the bay, Plymouth or Portsmouth to Santander and Bilbao, are famous among British travelers for exactly one thing, and it is not the scenery. 2 days out of sight of land, in a ship built for it, with stabilizers running, and the crossing is still routinely described by passengers as the worst sea time of their lives. Crockery is stowed, outer decks close, some sailings are canceled outright, and the cancellation is the sensible option, not the dramatic one. For yachtsmen, crossing Biscay is a rite of passage that experienced sailors plan around like a mountaineering expedition, waiting for a weather window, choosing whether to make the direct run across the middle or to hug the French coast and accept more time in shallower water, watching the barometer and knowing that the middle of the bay is the furthest most of them will ever be from a lifeboat station. That is the ordinary version. The disasters in this story are what happens when the ordinary version meets one broken component. There is a second thing the shelf does, and this one is geometric rather than energetic. Waves refract. When one end of a wave crest reaches shallow water before the other end, that end slows down, and the crest swings. The whole wave train bends toward the shallows, like a column of marching soldiers wheeling, when the men on one flank shorten their step. Across a bay shaped like a funnel, refraction does something specific and unpleasant. It aims the energy. Watch where it aims. An Atlantic swell entering from the west sweeps across the bay, feels the shelf, bends, and concentrates toward the inside of the corner, the southeast angle, where the French Landes coast meets the Spanish Basque coast. That corner is the closed end. There is no exit. Whatever comes into the bay in a westerly gale ends up there, whether it is wave energy, floating timber, spilled oil, or a ship with no engine. That is the answer to the corner, and it is worth holding on to because it explains something that looks like coincidence and is not. The southeast corner also holds one of the strangest pieces of seafloor in Europe. Off the little resort towns of Caberton and Hossegor, where French surfers park along the dune road and walk over the sand with boards under their arms, the continental shelf is interrupted by a canyon. The head of the Caperton Canyon begins a few hundred meters from the shoreline. Not a few hundred kilometers, hundreds of meters. The canyon cuts into the shelf up to about the 30-meter depth contour and then runs roughly parallel to the coast, deepening as it goes, eventually reaching thousands of meters. Stand on that beach, and the deep ocean is closer to you than the far end of the town. Swimmers have drowned in the rip currents that form over the canyon head. Surfers ride waves there that arrive with almost no shelf to sand them down, because the canyon delivers deep water energy right up against a shallow bar. It is a beautiful place, and it is also a place where the geometry of the whole bay is compressed into a few hundred meters of water. Hold that image, because a ship is going to break in half within sight of it. And the reason it happened there rather than somewhere else is the reason a canyon exists there at all. Now bring the scale down from the map to a wheelhouse, because none of this matters until there are people in it. A ship crossing Biscay in winter is usually doing something entirely routine. She is carrying steel or grain or fuel oil or cars from a northern European port to Iberia or the Mediterranean, and Biscay is simply the bit in the middle. The crew are not adventurers. They are working. They are 8 or 15 or 22 people on a vessel that costs more than they will earn in 10 lifetimes, and their job is to move it from A to B on a schedule. What the bay does to that routine is specific. A ship that would ride an Atlantic swell comfortably starts taking green water over the bow. The pitching becomes violent enough that the propeller lifts clear at the top of each cycle and races in air, and the engine room has to throttle back to stop the machinery destroying itself. Speed drops. With speed goes steerage, and with steerage goes the ability to hold a heading into the sea. Cargo lashings that were adequate for a gentle roll start working loose under a sharper one. And every hour the ship spends slowed down is an hour longer in the bay. That is the first mechanism, and you can see it happen without any storm at all. But a moving ship in bad weather is a problem with options. There is a much older, much faster version of the Biscay trap, and it does not need a ship, a storm, or a warning. It needs a calm day. On the morning of 20 April 1878, the weather along the north coast of Spain was as good as it gets in April. The press of the day described a fine morning with light northeasterly breezes. It was Easter Saturday, Sábado de Gloria. And along the whole Cantabrian and Basque coast, the fishing fleets went out. These were open or half-decked boats, driven by sail and oars, carrying crews of a dozen or so men. They fished within sight of the mountains. That was not a limitation they resented. It was how the fishery worked. The anchovy and the bonito came inshore in their seasons, and the boats went out and came back the same day. Through the morning, the wind backed round to the south. A southerly on that coast is a warm, dry, offshore wind coming down off the Cantabrian mountains, and it comes with a rise in temperature and a flattening of the sea. To a fisherman, it looked like a poor day for fish, and there was no catch worth the name. That is a detail worth sitting with, because it is the reason so many men died. No fish meant no money. These crews were not paid a wage for turning up. They were paid a share of what they landed. A boat that came home empty had earned nothing for its owner, nothing for its crew, and nothing for the families ashore. So when the morning produced nothing, most of the fleet did the rational thing and stayed out, working further, waiting for the fish to move. Around midday the wind arrived. It came from the northwest, and it came as a line. Not a rising breeze, not a gradual freshening. A squall front that crossed the sea with rain behind it and dropped the temperature as it passed. The accounts of that day describe wind of hurricane force, arriving on water that had been almost flat, over boats that were under sail with their gear in the water. A Galerna does not build. That is the entire point of it. The mechanism is now reasonably well understood, and it is worth explaining because the physics is the reason the warning time is so short. Along that coast in spring and summer, you often get a shallow layer of cool, moist marine air sitting over the sea, with warmer, drier continental air above and inland. The Cantabrian Mountains run parallel to the coast, close to it and high. A wall 1,000 meters and more, only a few tens of kilometers from the water. When a disturbance comes down from the northwest, the cold marine air cannot climb the mountains and cannot spread inland. It is trapped between the mountain wall and the sea surface, and it runs east along the coast as a narrow, fast-moving front, hugging the shoreline the way water runs along a gutter. Modern studies of these coastally trapped disturbances describe exactly this: a wind reversal, a sharp pressure jump, a temperature fall, and gusts that can exceed 100 kilometers an hour, traveling west to east along the Cantabrian and Basque coast, and often intensifying as they go east. Temperatures can fall 10 degrees or more in under half an hour. For a modern observer with a barograph and a satellite loop, those signatures are visible. For a crew in an open boat in 1878, the visible signature was a line of cloud to the northwest and perhaps 20 minutes. They had gear in the water. Nets and lines take time to recover. And every minute spent hauling was a minute not spent running for shelter, while every minute spent running was gear abandoned and a season's investment lost. That is not recklessness. That is the arithmetic of a fishery, where the boat and the net are the family's capital. The wind reached them with the sea still low. A Galerna does not arrive with a sea already built, and that is the thing that makes it lethal. In a way, an ordinary gale is not. A gale gives you a rising swell hours before its worst, and the swell is the warning. Here the wind hit flat water and the sea got up underneath the boats within minutes. Short, steep, breaking wind sea over shoaling ground, with no long swell underneath it to smooth anything out. Boats that could have run before a big Atlantic Sea were rolled by a small vicious one, and they were close to home. That is the part that people misread. Being 3 miles off Bermeo was not safety, because 3 miles off Bermeo in a northwesterly means the harbor entrance is dead downwind, and running for a downwind harbor entrance in breaking sea is one of the most dangerous maneuvers in small boat seamanship. The mouth is narrow. The sea steepens as it shoals across the bar. A boat surfing down a breaking crest toward a stone jetty has no brakes and very little steering. Some crews made it in. Some were rolled at the entrance in front of people standing on the harbor wall. There was in 1878 no organized rescue service on that coast. Nothing existed to be launched. What existed was other fishermen and men on the shore with ropes. Some crews did get in. The ones who survived generally did so by doing one of two things: running downwind early, before the sea had built, and accepting whatever landfall they could reach, or by getting far enough offshore that they had room to lie to and ride it out, rather than being driven onto a shore. Both required a decision inside the first few minutes of a wind that had arrived without notice, on boats where the skipper had to weigh his gear, his crew, and his chances at the same moment. The geography of those villages made the last mile the worst of it. Ilanksob is built into the face of a cliff, at an angle that makes the streets into staircases. Its harbor is a scrap of shelter under a headland, and a northwesterly puts the sea directly into it. Mundaka sits at the mouth of an estuary behind a sandbar. The same bar that today produces one of the best-known left-hand waves in Europe, which tells you precisely what happens to a swell arriving there. Bermeo's entrance is a narrow slot between stone moles. On a normal day, these are working harbors. In a northwest gale, they become the last obstacle rather than the destination. And a boat that has survived the open sea can be lost in the final 100 meters in front of the people waiting for it. Bodies and wreckage came ashore for days along the coast east of the fleet's positions, which is to say downwind, which is to say in the same direction everything else in this story travels. The counts vary by source and by how the dead were tallied. More than 320 men were lost that afternoon along the Cantabrian and Basque coast. The figure most often cited is 322, split roughly between the Cantabrian ports and the Basque ones, with some Basque accounts giving a lower total, nearer 144 for their own coast. The disagreement is real, and it is worth naming rather than smoothing over. Parish registers, provincial governors, and newspapers were counting different populations on different days. What nobody disputes is the concentration. Bermeo alone lost 98 men. Elanksobe lost 49. Mundaka lost 15. Ondaroa 13. Lekeitio 6. Close to 500 boats were destroyed or lost. Bermeo in 1878 was a town of a few thousand people. Losing 98 working men in one afternoon is not a disaster that a community absorbs. It is a demographic event. The economic aftermath was as severe as the human one, and the two were the same thing. A fishing family's capital was the boat and the nets, and both were destroyed. A crew's income was a share of a catch that would not now be landed. In villages that lost a third or more of their working men, the surviving population was suddenly women, children, and the old. With no vessel to put to sea and no way to buy one. Subscriptions were raised across Spain, money collected in cities that had never smelled an anchovy, and it helped, and it did not rebuild a fleet. So the obvious question, then and now, could it have been seen coming? The uncomfortable answer is that it partly could, and that the men who could see it were the ones with the least freedom to act on it. Basque and Cantabrian fishermen had a body of knowledge about this specific phenomenon that was accumulated over generations and encoded in ordinary language. They had a word for it. They knew the season for it, late spring through summer, the months when the land heats and the sea does not. They knew the signature, a still, hot morning, an unusual clarity in the air, a southerly wind that kills the fishing, an oily flatness on the water, a particular quality of light. Some crews would look at a morning like that and simply not go, or go and stay within an hour of the harbor mouth. That is not folklore. That is a forecast. A probabilistic judgment built from pattern recognition over decades of exactly the kind that modern forecasting formalizes with instruments. What it lacked was not accuracy. It lacked authority, and it lacked money. A skipper who kept his boat in on a beautiful morning because the light looked wrong had to explain to 12 men and their families why nobody ate that week. Do that 3 times when nothing happens, and the 4th time your crew sails with someone else. The regional knowledge said stay in. The economics said go out. On 20th April 1878, most of the fleet went out, and the ones who went furthest to find fish had the furthest to run. What followed the disaster was, by 19th century standards, an unusually direct response. Life-saving societies were formed and expanded along the coast, and the technical response was to attack the specific failure. Open boats swamped by breaking sea, decked and half-decked vessels spread through the fleet. Larger, heavier, more seaworthy hulls came in. Later, motorization replaced dependence on a sail that was useless the instant the wind reversed. Weather bulletins and coastal warning systems, in their infancy elsewhere in Europe, were pushed onto that coast precisely because that coast had proved it needed them. The institutional response has a date. On 19th of December 1880, the Sociedad Española de Salvamento de Náufragos was constituted in Madrid, a national volunteer shipwreck rescue society, with local committees established along the stretches of coast where wrecks were most frequent, which meant the North in general, and this coast in particular. It was declared of public utility in 1887 and given a central council to coordinate the local stations. Its equipment, for its first decades, was a wooden pulling boat. Men rowed out into breaking sea to take other men off wrecks, and between 1880 and 1940 they saved hundreds of lives doing it. That is the direct ancestor of the Spanish Maritime Rescue Service, whose helicopters appear later in this story, and the line from one to the other is unbroken. Notice what kind of fix this is. It does not stop anyone from dying at sea. It shortens the distance between someone being in the water and someone else arriving to pull them out. Every subsequent improvement in this story is a version of the same idea, executed with better machinery. And every one of them runs into the same ceiling, which is that arriving takes time and the sea does not wait. The forecasting side moved too. Spain's Central Meteorological Institute was established in the 1880s, and coastal storm warning arrangements spread through European maritime nations in the same period. Signal masts and semaphores at harbor entrances telegraphed warnings from central offices to port captains, a cone hoisted to indicate a gale and its direction. For the first time, a fisherman in a harbor could receive information generated somewhere he had never been about weather he could not yet see. For a Galerna, all of that helps less than you would hope, and the reason is in the physics rather than the institutions. A telegraph warning of an approaching depression is useful when the depression takes a day to arrive. A narrow front running east along a mountain wall at speed does not give the telegraph time to be relevant. The warning system was built for the wrong timescale, and the timescale was the whole problem. Every one of those changes worked. That is the reversal, and it is the first of several in this story where the fix is genuine and the consequence is not what anyone intended. A bigger, decked, eventually engined boat is safer in a breaking sea. It is also capable of going further out and staying longer, so it did. The Basque fleet moved off the inshore grounds and out onto the offshore banks, chasing tuna and bonito dozens of miles from land. Safety became range, and range became exposure. The boats stopped being swamped a mile off the jetty because they were no longer a mile off the jetty. On 12th August 1912, the Bermeo fleet was working roughly 45 miles north of Cape Matsichaco, far beyond anything a boat of 1878 could have contemplated, when another Galerna crossed the coast. The vessels were better, the distance was worse. 143 men were lost, 116 of them from Bermeo alone, with 16 from Lake Quitio, 8 from Elanchobe, and 3 from Onderoa. 75 women in Biscayan ports were widowed in a single night. It is remembered in the Basque Country as the greatest workplace disaster of the century within those borders, and Bermeo still holds a memorial for it every August. 34 years of real improvement, and the same wind, and the town lost more men in proportion than most towns lose in a war. That is the shape of the pattern this whole story keeps repeating. So it is worth stating plainly, the first time it appears, in the Bay of Biscay. Improvements in survivability have repeatedly been converted into increases in exposure, not through stupidity, through economics. Every gain in capability gets spent because the reason people are out there in the first place has not changed, which leads directly to the harder question. If a sudden wind can kill men in open boats a few miles from home, what does it take to kill the most heavily built, most modern, most expensively engineered ship in the world? Almost nothing, as it turns out, and no Galerna at all. In September 1870, the strongest navy on Earth had a problem it could not solve on paper. The invention of the rotating armored gun turret had made the broadside battleship obsolete, but nobody knew how to combine a turret with the sail rig that a fleet still needed for ocean range. A turret has to fire in a wide arc. Masts, rigging, and shrouds occupy exactly that arc. Worse, a turret is enormously heavy and sits high, and a low hull is what you want if you are trying to keep weight down and present a small target. Captain Cowper Phipps Coles of the Royal Navy had a design that he believed solved it. He had been pushing it for years, and he had done something officers were not supposed to do. He had gone public. He wrote to the newspapers. He lobbied members of Parliament. He built a constituency for his ship outside the Admiralty, and by the mid-1860s, public and parliamentary pressure had become strong enough that the Admiralty, against the professional judgment of its own chief constructor, Edward Reed, agreed to let him have his ship built by Lairds of Birkenhead. Her name was Captain. She was a sea-going turret ship, armored, twin-turreted, and rigged with the tallest masts in the Royal Navy. The whole concept depended on one number, freeboard, the height of her deck above the waterline. Coles designed her with 8 feet of it. She was completed with about 6 feet 6 inches. Understand what that means because it is not a rounding error. She came out of the yard roughly 735 long tons heavier than her design. Accumulated weight from construction that nobody adequately tracked. And that extra weight pushed her about 22 inches deeper into the water than intended. Her center of gravity rose roughly 10 inches during construction. Every one of those changes worked in the same direction. Her sister concept, the Admiralty's own turret ship Monarch, had 14 feet of freeboard. Captain went to sea with less than half of it. The objections had been on paper for years. Edward Reed, the Admiralty's chief constructor, had argued consistently that a low freeboard ship carrying a full sail rig was a bad combination, and his department's concerns about the design were overruled. He eventually resigned. That is not hindsight assembled after a funeral. It is a documented professional disagreement in which the losing side was correct. The comparison was available too. The Admiralty had built its own sea-going turret ship, Monarch, to answer the same requirement. And the two ships operated in the same squadron. Officers who served in both could feel the difference in how they behaved. Captain was widely admired precisely because she was so low and so fast and looked so purposeful. She was, in the language of the day, a smart ship. And the quality that produced that impression was the quality that killed her. Freeboard is not about staying dry. Freeboard is the reserve of buoyancy that rights a ship when she heels. When a normal ship rolls, the immersed shape of her hull changes in a way that pushes back. The more she leans, the harder the water shoves her upright. That restoring push is generated by the volume of hull that goes under as she leans. Take the freeboard away, and there is very little hull left to go under. Roll her past a certain angle and the deck edge submerges, and once the deck edge is under, the restoring force does not increase anymore. It collapses. Later analysis of her actual completed condition found that Captain could capsize at about 21 degrees of heel. 21 degrees is not extraordinary. A sailing warship under press of canvas in a stiff breeze heels that far as a matter of routine. A ship that capsizes at 21 degrees is not a ship with a narrow margin. She is a ship with no margin, being sailed by men who did not know it. The ship kept being asked questions she could not answer safely, in front of people who could not read the answers. She rolled well in the sense that she came back. That is exactly what a ship with a small range of stability does, right up until the angle at which she does not. Comfort is not a stability curve. A ship can feel stiff and lively and reassuring at 10 degrees and be finished at 22. They did not know it because the numbers had not reached them. An inclining experiment is a simple and old procedure. With the ship afloat and quiet, known weights are moved a known distance across the deck. The resulting angle of heel is measured, and from that you can calculate where the center of gravity actually sits. Not where the drawing said it should sit. That calculation is what tells you the angle at which the ship stops coming back. It had been carried out. The numbers existed inside the constructive establishment. They had never been worked into a stability assessment and put into the hands of the men taking her to sea. Her captain, Hugh Burgoyne, a Victoria Cross holder from the Crimea, sailed a ship whose stability curve was, in practice, an unpublished document. And she was doing well. That is the part that makes this incident so much worse than a straightforward blunder. Captain went on 2 cruises in 1870 and performed respectably. She handled. She was fast under steam. Her turrets worked. Public opinion, which had built her, was vindicated. Coles himself came aboard for the 3rd cruise as a guest to watch his ship work. On the evening of 6 September 1870, the combined Channel and Mediterranean squadrons, 11 ships under Admiral Sir Alexander Milne, were in the Atlantic off Cape Finisterre, at the southwestern approach to the Bay of Biscay. Finisterre sits just outside the line that formally closes the bay, and it is only honest to say so. This is the doorway, rather than the room. It is the same Atlantic, the same swell train, and the same wall of Iberian shelf that the whole system runs on, and every ship that enters Biscay from the south passes through it. The weather freshened through the evening. Milne, in the flagship, came aboard Captain earlier that day, and by his own later account, was uneasy about how low she sat. He noted how little of her was above water. He went back to his own ship. The squadron shortened sail as the wind rose. Nothing about the night was extraordinary for a fleet at sea. The wind is generally described as rising from around force 6 to something in the force 9 to 11 range in squalls. Shortly after midnight, the squadron was hit by a heavy squall. On Captain, the officer of the watch had men on deck taking in sail. She heeled. Survivors put it at around 18 degrees, an angle that on any other ship in the squadron would have meant a wet night and nothing else. On her, 18 degrees was already most of the way to the edge. Her officers made every decision on that voyage using a mental model of their ship that was wrong in the one dimension that mattered. The order was given to let go the topsail halyards. The standard response, spilling the wind out of the sails. On a normal ship, the pressure comes off and she comes up. She did not come up. She kept going over. On Captain, the hull could not do the rest, and there was no second remedy, because there is nothing else you can do about a ship that has run out of righting arm. You cannot pump her upright in the time available. You cannot shift ballast in seconds. Once the deck edge was under, the process was mechanical, and it finished itself. The whole thing took a matter of moments. Her low deck went under, and the restoring force that should have stopped her simply was not there. She rolled onto her beam ends, turned turtle, and floated upside down for a short time before sinking. Almost everyone aboard was below decks, asleep, at the moment their ship inverted. Consider the position of the men below. Almost all of a warship's company is asleep or off watch at midnight. Their world is a series of compartments reached by ladders, lit by oil lamps, with hatches that in bad weather are closed against the sea. The ship rolls, then keeps rolling, and the direction of down changes. Ladders become ceilings. Doors that open downward now open upward against their own weight. 18 men lived. Some accounts put the number at 27. The commonly cited figure is 18. What is not in dispute is how they survived. They were on deck, they were thrown clear, and they got to a steam pinnace that floated free of the wreck. That boat, with a handful of men in it, reached the Spanish coast near Corcubion. They walked to find someone who could send a telegram. That is how the Royal Navy found out. Not from a signal, not from the squadron. The other ships did not know for certain what had happened until the news came back around from Spain. A fleet of 11 ships in company lost one of its number in the night without being able to confirm it. Roughly 472 people died. Among them was Cowper Phipps Coles, killed by the ship he had spent a decade arguing into existence, and Hugh Burgoyne, who had won the Victoria Cross for going into a Baltic fortress under fire. Nothing else in the squadron was lost. 10 other ships went through the same squall in the same water on the same night and arrived at Vigo. That is the finding that matters. And it is why this is not a story about a storm. The sea did not single her out. She was simply the one ship present that could not survive an ordinary night. The court-martial ran from 27 September to 8 October 1870. Its verdict was extraordinary for the Victorian Navy in that it did not stop at the officers. The court found that the ship had been built in deference to public opinion, expressed in Parliament and through other channels, and against the views and opinions of the controller and his department. In plain language, a warship was designed by campaign, and the professionals who said it was dangerous were overruled by people who wanted it to exist. The consequences reshaped the profession. Britain built no more masted turret ships. Within a few years, the capital ship had shed its sails entirely, and devastation went to sea as a mastless, steam-only turret ship, a design that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, and which was, in effect, the argument captain lost, being won by her wreck. Stability calculation moved from a specialist's afterthought into the core of warship design, and in 1883 the discipline was formalized with the creation of the Royal Corps of Naval Constructors. The practice of building to a public campaign rather than to a stability curve acquired, permanently, a very bad name. A memorial to the ship's company stands in the crypt of St. Paul's, so one loop closes and another opens. The newest ship in the fleet died of a defect in her own numbers, not of the weather, and the fix was arithmetic. But the arithmetic only protects the ship. It says nothing about where the ship is when something else goes wrong, and it does nothing at all about the question that has been sitting underneath this whole story. Why does anybody keep going through here? Because the alternative is worse, and the geography that makes Biscay dangerous is exactly the geography that makes it unavoidable. Take a cargo out of Rotterdam, Antwerp, Hamburg, Gdansk, Immingham, or Le Havre and send it to Lisbon, Casablanca, Algeciras, Barcelona, Genoa, Piraeus, Dakar, Lagos, or through Suez to Asia. Now put a finger on the chart and find a route that does not cross the Bay of Biscay. There isn't one. The European continent hangs down into the Atlantic, and Biscay is the notch in its shoulder. Every ship going from northern Europe to anywhere south has to get round the corner of Brittany and then round the corner of Spain. And the water between those two corners is the bay. You can, in theory, go round the outside. Stand well out into the Atlantic west of the bay. Keep 400 or 500 miles of sea room, and come back in south of Finisterre. Ships do exactly this when the forecast is bad enough. It costs. It costs a day or two of steaming. It costs fuel at several hundred tons a day on a big ship. It costs a missed berth window at the far end, and the berth window is not a small thing. Arrive outside your slot and you may wait days for another one, with the charterer counting every hour. So the bay is crossed because crossing it is cheaper, and it is crossed constantly. The traffic separation scheme off Ushant, at the northern gate, is one of the busiest pieces of regulated water anywhere. It exists because in March 1978, the tanker Amoco Cadiz lost her steering off Brittany, drifted ashore, and put more than 200,000 tons of crude oil onto the Breton coast. The response was to impose lanes, one stream going south, one going north, a separation zone between them, and a coastal route for smaller craft, all pushed further offshore than ships had previously been willing to go. Look at what that scheme really is. It is a funnel. It takes an enormous volume of shipping and concentrates it into defined lanes at a single geographic pinch point, at the exact place where a ship coming south stops having the English Channel's shelter and starts having the Atlantic on her beam. Traffic separation dramatically reduced collisions. It also guaranteed that every one of those ships passes through the same few miles of water on the same headings. And it put them into that water in a specific place, near the top of the bay, with the whole of Biscay downwind of them in a westerly. Downwind is the operative word, and it deserves a moment, because it is the mechanism that makes this bay different from a merely rough one. A lee shore is a coast that the wind is blowing onto. For a ship with power and steering, a lee shore is a nuisance. For a ship without them, a lee shore is a countdown. She stops being a vessel and becomes an object with a drift rate, and the only question is how many hours of sea room she has left. Now recall the shape. Biscay is open to the west. The prevailing weather, especially in winter, comes from the west and southwest. So for a disabled ship anywhere in the bay, the lee shore is not a stretch of coast. It is the entire eastern and southern boundary, 400 kilometers of France and 400 kilometers of Spain, arranged in a right angle around her. There is no direction in which drifting is safe. In the North Sea, a disabled ship might drift into open water. In the Atlantic west of Ireland, she might drift for weeks. In Biscay, she drifts toward the corner, always. And the corner is where the shelf shallows and the waves steepen, and the surf breaks. That is the trap, fully assembled. A funnel that concentrates the traffic, a shelf that concentrates the energy, and a coastline arranged so that losing power means running out of options in a known direction at a known speed. The Amico Cadiz deserves more than a footnote here, because it is the clearest documented case of the thing that has been implied throughout this story. That the delay between a ship losing control and a tow being connected is not always a distance problem. She was a very large crude carrier, over 300 meters long, carrying somewhere around 220,000 tons of crude oil, and on the morning of 16th of March 1978 she was off northwest Brittany. This is the north coast, outside the bay proper. The boundary matters, and it should be stated. It is the same approach, the same swell, and the same weather system, at the doorway rather than inside the room. At around 9:45, a heavy sea struck her rudder, and she stopped answering the helm. The cause was mundane in the way that these causes always are. Studs in the hydraulic steering gear sheared, and the hydraulic fluid was lost. A 300-meter ship with a full engine and no steering is, functionally, a disabled ship. Her master, Pasquale Bardari, called for salvage tugs about 2 hours later, and a tug came, the German salvage tug Pacific, under Captain Hartmut Weinert, which made contact at around 11:30 in the morning. Then the argument started, and it lasted until 4 in the afternoon. The dispute was about the terms of the salvage contract. The standard instrument Lloyd's Open Form is a no-cure, no-pay agreement in which the salvor's reward is decided later by arbitration. The master of a casualty can sign it on the spot. Bardari did not have authority to sign, and approval had to come from the ship's owners in Chicago. Roughly 4.5 hours passed between the tug being alongside and the acceptance being received. 4.5 hours of a laden supertanker drifting toward the Brittany coast, with a tug in sight of her the whole time. The tow was eventually attempted, and it parted. She went onto the Port Saul rocks, a few kilometers from the coast, and broke apart. Her entire cargo went into the sea and onto some 300 kilometers of Breton coastline. It remains one of the largest tanker spills ever recorded. The lesson that got institutionalized was traffic separation, and the Ushant scheme is its monument. The lesson that took longer to institutionalize was the other one, that when a disabled ship's clock is running, the delay can come from a fax machine. Modern arrangements, including the special compensation provisions that reward salvors for preventing environmental damage even when the ship is lost, and state-funded emergency towing vessels that do not need a contract to sail, exist because of afternoons like that one. That is why the Abel Bourbon sits in Brest. She and her sisters are not commercial tugs waiting for a job. They are public assets funded by the French state stationed permanently at the pinch points. Ushant at the top of the bay, the Channel, the Mediterranean, and moved forward to Camaret when the wind gets up so that they are already outside the harbor when the call comes. They are the state's admission that geography cannot be legislated away, and the only counter to a lee shore is a machine that is already close. And there are very few of them, which is a decision about money. And it means the bay has a coverage map with a large hole in the middle. Somebody is watching all of it. And it is worth being precise about what watching can and cannot do. The French Maritime Surveillance Center at Corson, on the Brittany coast opposite Ushant, runs the radar and traffic service for the separation scheme. Since the carriage of automatic identification transponders became mandatory for merchant ships in the early 2000s, every one of those vessels broadcasts her identity, position, course, speed, draft, and destination continuously. On a screen in that building, the entire northern gate of the Bay of Biscay is a moving diagram with names attached, updated every few seconds. Well over 100 merchant ships a day under dozens of different flags, funneled into 2 lanes. An operator there can see a ship drifting out of her lane before her own bridge team has necessarily noticed. They can call her by name on the radio. They can query a vessel that is behaving oddly, warn her of a hazard, and, for ships in French waters and under the powers that came out of the earlier disasters, require a vessel in difficulty to accept assistance or to move. What they cannot do is stop a ship in international water from continuing. They cannot make an engine start, and they cannot shorten the distance to the nearest tug. Surveillance solved the collision problem, which was a real problem and a large one. 2 ships converging can be separated by a phone call. A ship losing propulsion cannot be helped by being observed, and the more comprehensively you observe a bay this size, the more clearly you can watch a casualty develop over days without being able to intervene. On the Modern Express, everyone concerned had a precise, continuously updated position for a ship they could not touch. Underneath the merchant traffic, there is another population entirely. The Bay of Biscay still carries substantial French and Spanish fishing fleets, trawlers, longliners, netters, working the shelf edge and the banks in vessels a fraction of the size of anything in the shipping lane. Commercial fishing remains, by a wide margin, one of the most dangerous occupations in Europe, and the reasons have not changed since 1878. Small vessels, heavy gear handled in a seaway, decisions driven by a share of the catch rather than a wage, and weather that arrives faster than the boat can run. The difference is that a modern trawler carries a radio, a satellite beacon, a life raft, and an immersion suit, and there is a rescue coordination center listening at all hours. That is the same trade the whole story keeps making. The people are much more likely to survive. The boat is not, and the boat is still what the family owns. It has been understood as a trap for as long as anyone has fought over it. In the Second World War, the Germans built fortified submarine bases along the bay's edge: Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, La Pallice, Bordeaux, because those ports put U-boats into the Atlantic faster than anywhere in Germany. To reach the Atlantic, they had to cross Biscay, and that crossing became one of the most concentrated air-sea battles of the war. RAF Coastal Command called it the Bay Offensive and described the bay as the trunk of the tree, the one place every boat had to pass. The campaign is worth a moment because it is the only period in which anyone deliberately turned the bay's geometry into a weapon, and the mechanics of how they did it are the same mechanics that govern everything else here. The bay was a choke point by construction. A submarine leaving Lorient or Brest for the North Atlantic convoy routes had a few hundred miles of Biscay to cross before she reached open ocean, and she had to do it twice per patrol. Aircraft cannot search an ocean. They can search a corridor. The technology that made the corridor searchable arrived in 2 pieces. The first was centimetric radar, the 10-centimeter sets that came into service from late 1942, which could pick up a surface submarine at night and, critically, operated on a wavelength the German search receivers of the day could not hear. The second was the Lee Light, a powerful searchlight slung under a patrol aircraft. Radar took the aircraft to within a mile in total darkness. The light came on for the last few seconds and turned a night attack into a daylight one. The counter moves were direct. Boats were ordered to cross submerged by day and charge batteries at night. Then, when night became lethal, to do the reverse. They were fitted with heavier anti-aircraft armament and told to stay on the surface and fight it out, which produced a period of gun duels between four-engine flying boats and submarines at very close range. They crossed in groups so the guns could support each other. And the Luftwaffe sent long-range Junkers 88 fighters out over the bay from French airfields specifically to hunt the patrol aircraft, which meant a Sunderland crew searching for submarines had to keep a lookout for fighters at the same time, hundreds of miles from any friendly airfield, in an aircraft with no chance of outrunning anything. The trial operations came first. Searches with names like Gondola, Enclose, and Derange run in sequence through the winter and spring of 1943 to test whether saturating a defined area actually worked. It did. In the summer of 1943, between roughly April and August, Allied aircraft killed more than 24 U-boats over the bay. Among them, several of the large supply submarines whose loss crippled the ability of other boats to stay at sea. The cost went both ways and it was paid in the same water. Coastal Command lost aircraft and crews over the bay throughout. To flak from boats that had decided to fight, to the Ju-88s, to weather, to fuel exhaustion, and to the plain difficulty of flying a long overwater patrol at low level in bad visibility. A crew that ditched in Biscay was in the same sea with the same distances and the same westerly wind pushing whatever survived toward the same coast. The tactical detail is the one worth keeping. Forced to submerge every time an aircraft appeared, a Type 7 U-boat that could make around 17 knots on the surface was reduced to a submerged speed of about 7, and the transit that should have taken 2 or 3 days took a week. The crews were not being killed by bombs most of the time. They were being killed by having to spend longer in a place where being found was likely. Time in the bay is the currency. It always has been. The fishermen of 1878 died because they stayed out an extra few hours. The U-boat crews died because they were forced to stay under. And a modern ship in trouble is in exactly the same economy, because the one thing nobody has ever been able to shorten is the time it takes to get to her. Two things happened to that arithmetic in the late 20th century, and they went in opposite directions. The first is that finding out became almost instantaneous. Satellite communications, digital distress alerting, and emergency position beacons collapsed the gap between a ship being in trouble and the world knowing about it, from hours or days to minutes. The second is that ships got thinner, not weaker in intent, thinner in fact. Steel is expensive and cargo pays, so hulls were optimized, and a hull that was optimized in 1975 and then worked hard for 24 years in ballast and loaded, in cold water and warm, with heated cargo tanks and salt in every void, is not the hull that came out of the yard. Which brings us to a small, elderly, entirely unremarkable tanker crossing the bay 2 weeks before Christmas. The Erica was 184 meters long, built in Japan in the mid-1970s, registered in Malta, owned through a single ship company, managed by another company in Italy, and chartered on that voyage by Total. That chain of names is not bureaucratic detail. It is the reason nobody with a permanent interest in her condition was standing on her deck. She left Dunkirk on 8 December 1999, carrying 30,884 tons of No. 2 heavy fuel oil, bound for Livorno. Heavy fuel oil is not crude. It is the thick, tarry residue left at the bottom of the refining process, so viscous at ambient temperature that it has to be heated in the tanks to be pumpable at all. Remember the heating. It matters later, in the water. She had 26 men aboard. On 11th December, she was in the Bay of Biscay with a westerly wind at force 8 to 9 and about 6 meters of swell. That is bad weather, and it is not exceptional weather. A ship of her size crosses Biscay in those conditions routinely in December. Then she developed a list. Here is the first warning, and it is a good one. Specific, physical, and legible. Fuel oil had leaked out of number 3 center cargo tank into number 2 starboard ballast tank. That ballast tank was now full of cargo. A ballast tank is not supposed to contain oil, and the only way oil gets into it is through a hole in the steel between them. The master, Karun Mathur, did the correct thing in the correct order. He sent an alert message to the French authorities. He assessed the list. And then he acted on it in the way any competent master would. He transferred cargo from tank to shift weight back across the center line and bring her upright. It worked. The ship came level. That success is the hinge of the entire incident, and it is worth being honest about why. The list was a symptom. Correcting the list treated the symptom and made the symptom disappear, which meant the visible evidence of the underlying failure went away while the failure itself did not. A ship with a hole worn through the steel between 2 of her tanks was now an upright ship with a hole worn through the steel between 2 of her tanks. She looked normal. Mathur informed the authorities that the situation was under control and that he was making for the port of Dongjus at reduced speed. Reduced speed is exactly right. Easing off is how you stop a hull working itself apart in a seaway. He was by any reasonable reading handling it. Look at what has just happened to his options, though. He is in Biscay, in a rising sea, with a structural problem he cannot see, in a ship whose cargo is the thing that will make his problem everyone else's problem. He has chosen the nearest reasonable refuge and slowed down to get there. Slowing down keeps the ship intact for longer, and it also keeps her in the bay for longer. There is no version of this decision that is purely good. To understand why a hole between 2 tanks is a mortal wound, you have to stop thinking of a ship as a container and start thinking of her as a beam. A 180-meter tanker floating in flat water is supported evenly along her length. Put her in a seaway, and that stops being true. When a wave crest is amidships and the troughs are at bow and stern, the middle is held up and the ends are unsupported, and the whole ship tries to bend downward at each end, hogging. Half a wavelength later, the crests are at the ends, and the trough is amidships, and she tries to bend the other way, sagging. She does this every few seconds, for days, loaded with tens of thousands of tons of cargo that has to be carried by the structure. The steel that resists that bending is not distributed evenly. The greatest stress is in the deck and the bottom, farthest from the neutral axis in the middle, exactly like the top and bottom flanges of a girder. The deck goes into tension while the bottom goes into compression, then they swap. Thousands of times a day. Now corroded. Ballast tanks are the worst environment on a ship. Alternately full of seawater and full of damp air. Warm, if they are adjacent to heated cargo, and almost never seen by anyone. Coatings break down. Steel wastes from the inside. A frame that was 15 millimeters thick becomes 10 and then 8, and it does so invisibly from the outside, because the paint on the hull looks fine. The certificates say the ship is fit. The certificates are based on surveys, and surveys are based on measurements, and measurements are taken at sample points by a person with a gauge who has to get into the tank to take them. So when fuel oil appeared in a ballast tank on the Erica, it was not a plumbing fault. It was structural steel that had wasted through. And the location matters more than the size of the hole because a beam does not fail everywhere at once. It fails where the section has been weakened, and then the load that was being carried there transfers to the steel next to it, which is also wasted, which then fails too. That is why the list corrected and the ship still died. The list was buoyancy. The buoyancy problem was fixable by moving weight. The strength problem was a beam quietly running out of section in a sea that was bending it every 8 seconds. Correcting the list did nothing to the bending, and slowing down, which was the right call and which reduced the bending, bought hours rather than days. At 6:05 on the morning of 12th of December, the Erica transmitted a mayday. She was breaking up. At 8:15, in international waters roughly 30 nautical miles south of Penmark, she broke in two. Now the rescue, and this is where the modern era genuinely and permanently changed something. French Navy helicopters, with support from Royal Navy aircraft, flew out to a tanker splitting apart in a December gale and took her people off the wreck one at a time on a wire. It is difficult to overstate what that involves. A helicopter has to hold position over a ship that is not just rolling but coming apart, in a wind that is force 8 or worse, with the aircraft's own downwash blasting the deck, while a winchman goes down onto that deck and clips a stranger into a harness. Each lift takes minutes. There were 26 of them. Every one of the 26 was off by 20 to 11 that morning. No injuries. 2 navies flew that morning, and the reason is worth understanding because it comes back at the end of this story. Search and rescue in the Eastern Atlantic is divided into regions, each with a coordinating center, and the center that owns the region is responsible for finding the aircraft, not for owning them. A French center facing 26 people on a breaking tanker does not care whose roundel is on the fuselage. It calls whoever can reach the position with fuel to spare and a winch that works. And on 12th of December 1999, that included British aircraft. The transfer itself is the slowest part, and there is no way to speed it up. The aircraft comes into a hover with the deck below it moving in 3 axes at once. The winchman goes down on the wire, gets his feet on a surface that is pitching and streaming water, finds a person who has probably never been winched before, and gets a strop under their arms. Then the wire takes the weight and both of them swing. Repeat. Each cycle costs fuel, and fuel is the clock the aircraft captain is actually flying to. Hold that against the captain in 1870. 472 dead, 18 survivors who got themselves ashore in a boat, and against Bermeo in 1878. The change is total. In 130 years, the problem of getting human beings off a dying ship in Biscay went from essentially unsolvable to routinely solvable. Nothing else improved. At 2:15 that afternoon, the salvage tug Abel Flandre got a line onto the drifting stern section and began towing it away from the coast, away from Belle-Île. That is a specific and deliberate act, not saving the wreck, but choosing where the wreck would end up. At 6 in the evening, the French authorities activated the Polmar Sea Plan, the National Pollution Response. The bow section went down on 13th of December. The stern followed at 10 to 3 that afternoon. The two halves came to rest about 10 kilometers apart on the seabed at around 120 meters. Somewhere between 19,000 and 20,000 tons of heavy fuel oil went into the Bay of Biscay. And then nothing happened, which is the part people forget. The ship broke on 12th of December. The oil did not arrive. For 11 days, the coast waited. Aircraft flew the slicks and watched them move. The heavy fuel oil, cold now, no longer heated by tank coils, had gone stiff and heavy, some of it floating in thick brown mats, some of it hanging just under the surface where an aircraft could not see it and a boom could not catch it. It drifted east. You already know where east goes. On 23rd December, 11 days after the breakup, the oil came ashore in southern Finistère. Over the following week, it kept coming, spreading down the coast through the end of December. Intermittent oiling eventually affected around 400 kilometers of shoreline between Finistère and Charente-Maritime, including the offshore islands, notably Belle-Île. The island the tug had spent the afternoon of the 12th towing the stern away from. It arrived over Christmas, onto beaches in winter, in the middle of the shortest days of the year. The cleanup was medieval in method and industrial in scale. Heavy fuel oil that has been in cold seawater for 11 days is not a liquid you pump. It is a heavy, sticky, brown-black emulsion. Water beaten into oil by wave action until the volume swells well beyond what was spilled. And on a beach, it behaves like tar. There is no clever machine for it. There are people with shovels, buckets, and squeegees, working in protective suits in January, on rock and sand, filling bags. Tens of thousands of volunteers came. Students, soldiers, local authority workers, pensioners, people who drove across France because they had seen it on television. They cleaned oyster beds by hand in the estuaries, and salt pans, and the tourist beaches that the entire regional economy depends on for 4 months a year. The wildlife toll was among the worst ever recorded in Europe. Tens of thousands of oiled seabirds were collected. Guillemot above all, birds that spend the winter sitting on the water in exactly the part of the bay where the oil went. Most of the birds recovered alive did not survive. Oiled plumage stops insulating. The bird gets cold, tries to preen, and swallows the oil. And there was still oil in the wreck. Roughly 2/3 of the cargo had gone with the 2 halves of the ship to the seabed, and it was going to keep coming out for years unless somebody removed it. So they removed it. Between April and September 2000, a consortium of offshore engineering companies working for the charterer carried out one of the more remarkable salvage operations of its era, pumping heavy fuel oil out of a broken wreck lying in 120 meters of water. The 2 sections were 10 kilometers apart. The oil in them was cold, meaning it had the consistency of roofing tar, so it had to be heated in place before it could be moved. Around 300 people worked offshore and another 40 ashore. About 10 to 11,000 tons were recovered. That operation is the quiet counterweight to everything else in this story. Given time, flat weather, money, and no emergency, the technical problem is solvable. Every capability that fails during the crisis works perfectly 6 months later. What cannot be manufactured is the 6 months. The other reason the Erica mattered so much is what she was on paper versus what she was in steel. She was 24 years old. She had passed through a succession of owners and names. Her registered owner was a company that existed to own one ship. Her manager was somewhere else. Her flag was somewhere else again. Her classification society had certified her. Her cargo belonged to a company in a 4th country. Every one of those links was legal, and each of them had individually, at Welida, a limited reason to know what the inside of her ballast tanks looked like. The French inquiry into the casualty concentrated on the structure. Corrosion and the condition of the hull were central to the findings on why a ship broke apart in weather she should have survived. The steel that was supposed to be holding her together was not what the certificates implied. The legal consequences went further than any tanker case in Europe had gone before. In 2008, a French criminal court convicted the owner, the manager, the classification society that had surveyed her in total, the charterer, ordering damages of around 192 million euros. The judgment survived appeal in 2010. The principle it established, that a charterer who selects a ship carries responsibility for that selection, reached straight into how oil majors vet tonnage. The regulatory consequences were faster still. The European Union produced 2 packages of maritime safety legislation named after the ship, accelerating the phase-out of single-hull tankers, tightening port state inspection, putting the classification societies under supervision, and creating a European Maritime Safety Agency in 2002. The double hull is worth pausing on, because it is the clearest modern example of the pattern this whole story runs on. Putting a second skin around the cargo works, and it works well, against the failure it was designed for. A grounding or a low-energy collision tears the outer plating and the cargo stays inside the inner one. Nobody serious argues against it. What it does not do is stop a hull girder from breaking, which is what actually happened to the Erica. And it introduces a space that did not exist before. A tall, narrow, enclosed void between the two skins, filled with seawater ballast on one leg of the voyage and damp air on the next, ribbed with structure, and awkward for a surveyor with a gauge to get into and inspect. That is a description of the ideal environment for corrosion, and the industry recognized it. Coating standards for ballast spaces were tightened internationally in the years that followed, precisely because the safer ship had created a new place for steel to waste away unseen. All of it was aimed at stopping the ship from breaking. None of it answered the question the Erica actually raised, which was not why she broke, but where she was supposed to go once she had started to. Think about what Mathur was doing when he headed for Dongjus. He was doing the thing every seaman has done since ships were invented, taking a damaged vessel toward shelter. Shelter is where you fix things. Shelter is where you pump the cargo out into another tank or another ship in flat water, with equipment and daylight and people who are not exhausted. And shelter is precisely what a coastal state has the strongest possible incentive to refuse, because a damaged tanker in your harbor is your oil spill. The Erica never got the chance to test that, because she broke before she reached anywhere. 3 years later, a bigger ship, in worse condition, with a more determined master, tested it completely. And the answer came back so clearly that it is still being argued about. The Prestige was a single-hulled tanker, Bahamas flagged, carrying 77,000 tons of heavy fuel oil from Latvia towards Singapore by way of Gibraltar. On 13th November 2002, off Cape Finisterre, in heavy seas and strong winds, something in her hull gave way on the starboard side. She took on a list reported at around 30 degrees. Her engine was damaged, and she lost control of her own movement. Aerial observation confirmed she was leaking fuel oil into the sea. 27 people were aboard. 24 of them were lifted off by helicopter, Spanish search and rescue doing in 2002 exactly what the French had done in 1999, and doing it well. 3 stayed: the master, Apostolos Mangouras, a Greek officer in his late 60s, the chief officer, and the chief engineer. That decision deserves respect rather than commentary. A ship with nobody aboard cannot be connected to a tug except by putting salvors onto her. And putting salvors onto a listing tanker in a gale is one of the most dangerous jobs at sea. 3 men stayed on a leaking, listing, powerless tanker in November in order to keep the option of a tow alive. Mangouras asked for a place of refuge. He wanted to bring the ship into sheltered water, get her stabilized, and get the cargo off. Spain refused. So, in effect, did France and Portugal. The decision made was that the ship would be taken away from the coast, out into deep water. Understand the logic, because it was not stupid. A ship leaking oil in deep water offshore disperses that oil across an enormous volume of sea. The same ship leaking in a bay concentrates it in shallow, enclosed, biologically rich water next to towns. Spain had watched Brittany scrape the Erica off its beaches 3 years earlier. Nobody in Madrid, Paris, or Lisbon wanted a repeat inside their own harbor. So the towing began, and it went on for 6 days. Spanish salvage tugs worked through the night of the 13th into the 14th, trying to get a line on. The ship's own emergency towing arrangement, the gear specifically designed for this exact situation, failed. Salvors from Smit eventually got a connection on the 14th, and the convoy started moving north-northwest, away from the Galician coast. On the 15th, the hull tore further. The damage on her starboard side opened over some 35 meters. Picture the physics. A tow line pulls at a single point on the bow. Behind that point is a hull already cracked, loaded with tens of thousands of tons of heated cargo, being pulled through a beam sea at a few knots. Every wave flexes her. Every flex works the crack. Towing a broken ship is not neutral. It is a slow, mechanical continuation of the thing that broke her. On the 16th, the course was changed again, this time to the southwest, to keep her out of Portuguese waters. Portugal did not want her either. Read that back. The most significant decision affecting where 60,000 tons of oil would end up was being made by adjusting a heading to stay out of a neighbor's exclusive economic zone. A powerless ship was being steered around a map of jurisdictions. At 9 in the morning on 19th of November, 6 days after her first distress call, the Prestige broke in two at 42 degrees 15 minutes north, 12 degrees 8 minutes west, roughly 130 nautical miles, about 250 kilometers, west-southwest of Cape Finisterre. The stern went down around noon. The bow followed about 4 in the afternoon. They sank into 3,500 meters of water. Now the cold arithmetic that nobody wanted to hear. Heavy fuel oil at the surface, in November, cools and thickens and moves slowly. Heavy fuel oil in cargo tanks 3.5 kilometers down at near freezing temperature and enormous pressure does not stay put. It leaks out through fractured plating, a little at a time, and rises. The eventual release from the wreck and the breakup came to something on the order of 63,000 tons. It came ashore for months, Galicia first, in successive waves that the Galicians named for their arrival like tides. The black tide, then the next one, then the next, then the Cantabrian coast, then the Basque coast, then southwest France. Surveys eventually counted well over 1,000 oiled beaches across several thousand kilometers of coastline in Spain, France, and Portugal. The sunken sections did not stop leaking, and this is where the Prestige stopped resembling any previous spill. The bow came to rest at around 3,800 meters, the stern at around 3,500. That is far beyond diver depth, far beyond most salvage practice, and roughly the depth at which the Titanic sits. Oil kept arriving on the Galician coast in pulses through the following year, and the Galicians could tell it was coming from below rather than from the surface, because it arrived without any surface slick to track. Cold, pressurized heavy fuel oil escaping from fractured tanks 3.5 kilometers down does not surface in a plume you can fly over. It works its way up over days. In 2004, between June and September, the Spanish government had the remaining oil extracted from the wreck. The method was borrowed wholesale from deepwater oil engineering, remotely operated vehicles working at nearly 4,000 meters, sealing the leaks, then hot-tapping the intact tanks, drilling into pressurized steel and fitting a valve at the same time, and pumping the contents into large aluminium shuttle containers that were floated to the surface. Around 13,700 tons were recovered that way. Official estimates suggested something in the region of several hundred to a little over 1,000 tons remained. Think about what that operation demonstrates. Spain sent robots to 4,000 meters and successfully performed keyhole surgery on a wreck. 18 months earlier, the same country could not find a sheltered anchorage for the intact ship. Ashore, the response was on a scale that has few parallels. The Galician Rayas, the drowned river valleys that produce mussels, clams, cockles, goose barnacles, and a very large share of Spain's shellfish, were closed. The people who work them are not industrial fishermen. Many are mariscadoras, women who harvest shellfish by hand at low tide on foot, holding licenses for specific beds. Their entire livelihood was a stretch of intertidal sand that was now covered in fuel oil. Volunteers came from the whole of Spain, by the tens of thousands, and scraped rock with hand tools in white overalls. The word chapapote, a regional term for tar, became the national name for the disaster. A protest movement, nunca mais, never again, put hundreds of thousands of people on the streets over the government's handling of it, and its political consequences reached the regional and national elections that followed. So did towing the ship out to sea reduce the damage or increase it? Nobody can answer that cleanly, and anyone who tells you they can is selling something. The counterfactual is unknowable. What is documented is that 6 days of towing in heavy weather kept a fracturing hull in motion, that the ship eventually broke anyway, and that she released roughly 3 times more oil than the Erika onto a longer stretch of coast. It is also documented that if she had broken up alongside a Galician quay, the concentration in that one place would have been catastrophic in a different way. The honest summary is that the choice was made under pressure with incomplete information by people who had every political incentive to push the problem offshore, and that the outcome was very bad. Manguras was arrested. He was held in Spain on bail set at €3 million, spent months in custody, and remained under restrictions for years. In 2013, a court in La Coruña acquitted him of the environmental charges and convicted him only of serious disobedience to the Spanish authorities for his initial refusal to let the ship be towed, with a 9-month sentence finding that the offense had not caused the environmental damage. In January 2016, the Spanish Supreme Court overturned that and convicted him of recklessness resulting in catastrophic environmental damage, sentencing him to 2 years. He was 81. Set aside what you think of the verdict and look at what the case established as a matter of practical fact. The only person who tried to bring the ship somewhere it could be saved was the person who ended up in the dock. The civil litigation ran for over a decade and crossed several jurisdictions, ending with the Spanish Supreme Court confirming liability in the region of $1.5 to $2 billion, and a long fight over how much of that could be recovered from the ship's insurers under the limits written into the policy. The compensation regime for tanker spills is capped by design. The damage is not. The international response was the IMO's guidelines on places of refuge for ships in need of assistance, adopted at the end of 2003, along with European rules requiring member states to designate refugees and to have an authority empowered to make the decision independently. The framework now exists. Whether a specific coastal authority, on a specific black night, with a specific leaking tanker 50 miles offshore, and a local population watching the news will say yes. That is not something a guideline determines, which leaves the coast itself. If a damaged ship cannot come in, and the coast is the thing being defended, then presumably the coast is the safe place. Look at what the same shelf does to the land. The wide, shallow Aquitaine and Armorican shelf that steepens waves has a second property. Shallow water is easy to push. When a deep, low-pressure system sits over the bay with strong onshore wind, 2 things stack water against the coast at once. The low pressure itself lets the sea surface rise, roughly a centimeter for every millibar the pressure falls. And the wind, blowing across a broad shelf where the water is only tens of meters deep, physically drags the surface layer shoreward and piles it up because there is no deep water underneath for it to circulate back through, over a narrow shelf that piling is limited. Over a shelf 150 kilometers wide, it is not. That is a storm surge, and on this coast, it is a shelf phenomenon before it is a wind phenomenon. Add a third factor that has nothing to do with weather at all. The Atlantic coast of France has a large tidal range, and the range varies through the month. French forecasters express it as a coefficient, and on the highest spring tides, the coefficient runs above 100. On those tides, the high water is already near the top of what the coast ever sees, and it is entirely predictable. It is in the almanac years in advance. Put a surge on top of one of those tides, and the arithmetic is simple and brutal. The surge is not the problem. The surge plus the tide is the problem, and the tide is known. On the night of 27 to 28 of February 2010, the storm Xynthia came across the Bay of Biscay from the southwest and made landfall on the Vendée and Charente-Maritime coast. Météo France had it. The forecast was good. Red warnings, the highest level in the French vigilance system, were issued for the departments concerned, and the warnings went out on the evening of the 27th. The surge that arrived was on the order of 1.5 meters. On its own, in the middle of a neap tide, It would have been an interesting night for hydrologists. It arrived instead within a couple of hours of a high spring tide, and the total water level at La Rochelle reached about 8 meters above chart datum, a figure without precedent in the available records for that station. Then the water met the defenses, and the defenses were not what people believed they were. Along that stretch of coast, the dikes are old. Many date to the 19th century and earlier, built during and after the Napoleonic era, and they were built for one purpose: to keep salt water off farmland. They were agricultural infrastructure designed to protect fields and grazing marsh from ordinary seasonal flooding. Nobody built them to protect houses because when they were built, there were no houses behind them. There were polders, cattle, and salt marsh. Between the late 1980s and 2010, more than 2,000 homes went up on that land at La Faute-sur-Mer and around it. Low ground, flat ground, cheap ground close to the beach, in a part of France where a house near the sea sells easily. And a very large proportion of what was built there was single story. The bungalow, the pavilion, the holiday house with everything on one level. Hold that detail. It is the difference between a flooded house and a fatal one. The water came over and through the dikes in the small hours, between about 2 and 3 in the morning, in the dark, while people were asleep. It did not arrive as a wave. It arrived as a rising level, fast. Inside a house, the water could go from ankle deep to chest deep in minutes, as the polder behind the breach filled like a basin. And a dike, once overtopped, does something specific that engineers have understood for centuries. It channels. The embankment that was supposed to stop the water instead concentrated its flow, speeding the propagation of the flood into the low ground behind. In a house with a staircase, you go up the staircase. In a single-story house with the water rising, there is nowhere to go but the roof space, and the roof space of a modern French bungalow has no window and often no easy hatch. Rolling shutters, closed for the night against the storm, are difficult to open from inside against water pressure and impossible to break through. The rescue that night was enormous, and it was almost entirely conducted by people waiting. More than 9,000 firefighters and emergency personnel were deployed across Vendée and Charente-Maritime, with helicopters working through the darkness, and the following morning. Crews went house to house in thigh-deep water, in boats where boats could be used, taking people off roofs and out of first-floor windows and off the tops of cars. Helicopters lifted people directly from rooftops in the flooded communes. The scale of what they achieved is genuinely large, and it is invisible in the death toll because saved people do not appear in it. Thousands of residents were evacuated, but the shape of the disaster made the rescue arrive on the wrong side of the critical hour. The water came in the middle of the night, in a defined pulse tied to the tide. It rose fast, it peaked, and then, this is the crucial bit, it drained. By the time daylight and organized rescue reached the worst-hit streets, the surge had already gone back out, and the houses had already flooded and emptied. The people who died did so in a window of perhaps an hour or two in the dark, before anyone outside those houses knew which houses to go to. That is a different failure from every marine incident in this story, and it is the more disturbing one. At sea, the constraint is distance. At La Faute-sur-Mer, the rescuers were in the same department. The constraint was information and time of day. Nobody knew which of several thousand identical single-story houses had someone trapped in it, and the flood that trapped them had come and gone before the question could be asked. Neighbors saved neighbors. A number of the survivors got out because someone with a 2-story house came for them, or because they got through a roof, or because a family member drove in from higher ground. Those are the accounts that came out afterwards, and they are the reason the toll was not far worse. 47 people died in France that night. Different counting methods put the total between 47 and around 53, depending on whether indirect deaths are included. The figure for the coastal flooding itself in Vendée and Charente-Maritime is 41. 29 of them died in the single commune of La Faute-sur-Mer, a place with about 1,000 inhabitants. Almost all of the dead were found inside houses. A high proportion were elderly. The warnings had been issued. The tide had been in the almanac since before those houses were built. The dikes were exactly as strong as they had always been, which is to say strong enough for cows. What killed those people was not a wave that nobody saw coming. It was the gap between a defense built for one purpose and a population placed behind it for another, and the fact that nothing in the planning process had ever been forced to reconcile the two. The legal reckoning was unusually direct for a natural disaster. In 2014, 5 people, including the mayor of La Faute-sur-Mer, René Maratier, stood trial for aggravated manslaughter. Maratier was sentenced to 4 years for having concealed the flood risk and permitted development that suited property interests. On appeal in 2016, that was reduced to a 2-year suspended sentence, together with a ban from public office. Whatever one makes of the sentences, the trial established as a matter of judicial record that the risk was known and the building continued. What the French state did afterwards was unusually blunt and deeply unpopular. Surveyors went through the flooded communes and marked out zones judged to be lethal in a repeat event, areas where the combination of ground level, defense condition, and building type meant that people in those houses would drown again. More than 1,000 properties were initially designated for compulsory purchase and demolition, a figure revised down as owners appealed and individual cases were re-examined. Hundreds were bought and knocked down. Understand the position of the people involved? They had survived a flood, and the state's response was to buy their house and destroy it. Some had lived there for decades. Some had bought with permission granted by the commune in good faith from a mayor who was later convicted. The land they were being removed from was worth a great deal precisely because it was near the sea. It is one of the few examples in Europe of managed retreat actually being carried out at scale, and the reason it could be carried out is that 29 people had died in the specific streets concerned. Coastal risk mapping is easy to ignore in the abstract. It is very hard to ignore when the map is drawn around houses whose occupants are known by name. The warning system changed too, and the change was precise rather than cosmetic. Before Xynthia, the French vigilance system warned about wind, rain, snow, and thunderstorm. It did not warn about the sea coming over the land. A red warning for violent wind is a message that tells people to stay indoors and close the shutters, which is exactly the wrong instruction if the danger is 1.5 meters of water arriving in a single-story bedroom at 3 in the morning. A dedicated coastal flooding category was added, so that the sea now generates its own alert with its own instruction. The dikes were rebuilt and raised in places. That is the fix everyone wants, and it is the fix that carries the oldest trap in this whole story. A higher dike protects more, so more gets built behind it, and the eventual failure happens against a larger population. And the important thing about Xynthia, for this story, is where it puts the danger, not offshore, not on a fishing bank, not in a shipping lane, not 200 miles out, in a bedroom, 400 meters from a beach, in a town with a supermarket and a pharmacy. The bay does not require you to go to sea, which raises the obvious objection. Surely the answer, for a ship at least, is to stay close to a port. Ports have tugs, ports have pilots, ports have shelter and lifeboats and a hospital 20 minutes away. Distance from help was the variable in every incident so far. So reduce the distance. On the morning of 5th February 2014, a cargo ship called Luno was 2 miles from the entrance to a French port with a pilot on her bridge, and none of it mattered at all. She was a small Spanish-flagged general cargo vessel, about 100 meters long, coming from the Basque coast in ballast, empty, to Bayonne, to load a cargo of steel grinding balls. In ballast means light, high out of the water, with a lot of hull exposed to the wind, and not much of it in the sea. Remember that. It is going to decide the next 20 minutes. The weather was the storm the French named Petra. Wind around 110 kilometers an hour. swell of 6 to 7 meters, coming out of the west, running straight into the corner of the bay where the Adar comes out and the Capbreton Canyon begins. This is the exact corner the refraction has been aiming at all along. Her voyage had already been awkward. She had had to stop and to run some stretches at low speed, and then the Bayonne pilots passed a message. 2 ships had to come out before Luno could go in. So she waited at reduced speed, off the port, in a storm. That is the pressure in this incident, and it is not glamorous. It is a birth cue. A ship that could have stood off to sea and burned a few more hours of fuel in open water instead held a position close to a lee shore, because that was where she needed to be when the berth came free. Every commercial vessel in the world does some version of this every day. Then the main engine stopped. The investigation by the Spanish authorities found the cause, and it is almost insultingly small. The engine could not be brought back into operation because a stop command had been issued by a thermostat, a temperature sensor in the cooling system identified in the report as T401, and not, as first assumed, because the ship had run out of starting air. A sensor said the engine was too hot. The safety system did what safety systems do and refused to let it run. A protection device designed to save the engine took the engine away. Understand what a ship is without her engine in that position. She is 100 meters of light steel with a huge windage area, sitting beam on to a force 10 gale, 2 miles upwind of a stone breakwater. Her drift rate in those conditions is not a slow thing. It is a walking pace, and the walk is short. They fought it. This is not a story about people freezing. The pilot ordered the starboard anchor let go, 4 shots of chain, roughly 100 meters of it, and then the port anchor as well, trying to get any purchase at all on the seabed. 2 anchors down is what you do when the situation is already bad. 2 tugs were requested from Bayonne, and the engineers did in fact get the propulsion engine running again a few minutes later. Every one of those responses was correct. None of them was fast enough, and the reason is worth spelling out, because it is the single most important operational fact in this entire story. Anchors in a storm on a sandy seabed. With a light ship being driven by a 110-kilometer wind and 6-meter swell, drag. They do not stop her. At best, they slow her and turn her. A tug summoned from a port in a gale has to get out through the harbor entrance and up to the casualty. And the entrance of Bayonne, at the mouth of the Adar, is itself a dangerous place in a west swell. And an engine that restarts a few minutes after it failed is an engine that restarts a few hundred meters further downwind, with the ship already sideways and the sea already on her. There were minutes between the failure and the impact. Rescue systems do not work in minutes. They work in hours, and the whole world had known about her problem almost instantly. She went on to the Cavalier's breakwater at Anglet, the northern jetty at the mouth of the Adar, in front of a town. People stood on the seafront and watched it happen. There is video of it, shot on phones from the promenade, and what is striking about the footage is how ordinary the surroundings are. Cars, apartment blocks, a beach where people surf all summer, with a ship being destroyed in the middle of it. The hull broke in 2 on the breakwater. The bow section ended up on the sand. The stern went over and capsized in the surf, meters from shore. 11 crew and the pilot were taken off by helicopter through the day, winched one at a time from a broken ship being worked by 6-meter swell against rock. The pilot came off last at 25 to 2 in the afternoon. 1 person was slightly hurt. 12 people lived. There is the pattern again, sharper than ever. Everyone survives. The ship is destroyed. And this time the ship is destroyed inside of a harbor, with a pilot aboard, with tugs available, with a functioning modern rescue service, and a phone in everyone's pocket. Diesel leaked from the cracked bunker tanks, and the first level of the French shore pollution plan was activated. The fuel was light, the sea was violent, and it dispersed. The investigators were blunt about the wider point. A ship of that size waiting off a port in storm conditions has essentially no margin, and the safe practice, standing off to seaward with sea room and burning the fuel, conflicts directly with the commercial reality of berth scheduling and tight voyage economics. The technical cause was a thermostat. The situational cause was that the ship was where a thermostat could kill her. The salvage was its own operation. A broken ship on a breakwater in an active surf zone cannot be refloated. She is cut up where she lies, in a working area that floods twice a day and is exposed to every westerly swell that arrives. Dismantling began on 17th of March, weeks after the grounding, and the work had to be timed around the weather in a place where the weather is the whole problem. The bow section, sitting on the sand where the beach meets the jetty, was taken apart in pieces small enough to be lifted off by crane and trucked away. Anglet's beaches reopened. The breakwater was repaired. Within a couple of seasons, there was almost nothing to see, which is the thing about this coast. It absorbs its own history very quickly and leaves it looking like a nice place for a swim. So proximity is not protection. A lee shore beats a tug every time because the wind works continuously and rescue works in stages. And that leaves the last version of the question, the one this whole story has been building toward. If 2 miles from a port is not enough sea room, what does it look like 150 miles out, in the middle of the bay, with nothing under the lee but 400 kilometers of France? On 26 January 2016, the Modern Express was doing an entirely ordinary job. She was a vehicle carrier, one of those slab-sided ships that look like a floating multi-story car park, 164 meters long, built in South Korea in 2001, registered in Panama. She was on passage from Gabon to Le Havre with about 3,600 tons of timber and heavy earth-moving equipment on her decks. A car carrier is a strange animal, and her stability is a bookkeeping exercise rather than a physical fact. A bulk carrier full of iron ore has its weight low and packed solid. Nothing in the hold can move because there is nowhere for it to go. A container ship's boxes are locked into fixed guides and twist locks. A car carrier is different in kind. To drive vehicles on and off, she is essentially a stack of wide-open decks connected by ramps, with as few obstructions as possible. And her hull is deliberately light because cars are bulky and weigh very little. That produces a ship with a great deal of volume, a lot of her mass high up in the structure, and enormous flat sides that act as a sail. Fill her with cars, and none of that is dangerous because cars are light, uniform, low, and lashed in rows. Fill her instead with logs and earth-moving equipment. A digger weighs what 100 cars weigh and it sits on rubber. And every assumption changes. Heavy point loads on decks, designed for distributed light ones. Round timber, which is the classic shifting cargo, because a log that starts to roll transmits its movement to the next log. And the security of all of it depends on chains and lashings tensioned by hand before departure. In a beam sea, a ship rolls, and a rolling ship applies a sideways force to everything aboard equal to a fraction of its weight. Increase the roll angle, and the sideways force increases. Somewhere there is an angle at which the lashings on the heaviest item are no longer sufficient, and that item moves half a meter. Now the ship is slightly heavier on one side, so she rolls a little further that way, which increases the sideways force on the next item, which moves. It is a runaway process, and it does not need a rogue wave to start it. It needs a long enough period of ordinary rolling to find the weakest lashing. There is a further trap that modern hull forms are prone to. If the wave encounter period lines up with the ship's own natural rolling period, the rolls reinforce each other and grow. Resonance. The same effect as pushing a swing in time. Broad, flat-sterned modern ships can also fall into parametric rolling, where a change in the underwater shape as waves pass along the hull pumps energy into a roll that was previously small, and a ship in head seas, with no apparent beam C problem, can develop violent rolling within a handful of cycles. Masters can break the pattern by changing course or speed, but only if they recognize it, and only if there is a course and speed available that is otherwise survivable. In the western Bay of Biscay, in a January gale, the lashings stopped being enough. Whatever the trigger, the outcome aboard the Modern Express was mechanical and irreversible. Cargo went to one side, the ship went with it, and the list settled at around 40 degrees because that was the angle at which the shifted weight and the hull's remaining riding ability balanced. 40 degrees is not a lean. 40 degrees means the deck is a wall. It means you cannot walk anywhere without climbing, that anything not bolted down has already fallen, that the fuel and lubricating oil suction pipes in the engine room are no longer reliably under the surface of their tanks, and that machinery starts shutting down. She lost propulsion. 40 degrees is a strange kind of stable. She was not sinking. She was not, in the immediate term, capsizing. She was simply lying over at an angle at which nothing aboard her could work. 22 people were now aboard a powerless ship lying on her side, about 150 nautical miles off the northwest corner of Spain, in winter, in the middle of the funnel. The distress alert was picked up in Britain, not Spain, not France. The search and rescue region covering that part of the eastern Atlantic was coordinated from the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center at Falmouth in Cornwall, working with the Spanish Center in Madrid. So the incident began with a British duty officer, several hundred miles away, running a rescue in international water using Spanish aircraft for a Panamanian-flagged ship managed from Asia threatening a French coast. That is not chaos. That is the system working exactly as designed. It is also a fair description of what modern shipping actually is, and it explains something about accountability that no single flag state can fix. The aircraft came out of Galicia, Helimer 401, a Salvamento Maritimo helicopter, made the long transit out to a ship lying at 40 degrees in a January sea and took 16 people off. They were flown to A Coruña. A second helicopter, Pesca de Saturn, lifted the remaining 6 and put them down at Salero, all 22 off, on the same afternoon. Consider what that means in terms of pure flying. 150 nautical miles out is close to the practical limit of useful helicopter work. The aircraft has to get there, hold a hover long enough to lift a group of people one at a time, and get back with a legal fuel reserve. A hover over a ship listing at 40 degrees is a hover over a moving, tilted, obstructed surface with masts and cargo lashings and a superstructure at the wrong angle. The winchman goes down into that. 16 lifts, and then 6 more, on the same day, in the same weather. Now hold that beside every other outcome in this story. Bermeo in 1878. 322 men in an afternoon within sight of land. The captain in 1870, 472, 18 survivors who saved themselves. Bermeo, again in 1912, 143. The Erica, 26 saved. The Prestige, 27 saved. The Luno, 12 saved. The Modern Express, 22 saved. That is the answer to the question of who reaches them and from how far. And the answer is good. Genuinely good. Coordinated coastal states, satellite alerting, professional air crews on standby, and helicopters with the legs to do it. The problem of taking people off a dying ship in the Bay of Biscay has essentially been solved. And now the other half of the incident begins, and it takes 8 days. The Modern Express was empty of people and full of everything else. Fuel oil in her bunkers, lubricating oil, cargo, and 3,600 tons of timber and machinery that had already proved it would move. She had no engine, no steering, and nobody aboard. She was an object. She began to drift east at around 3 knots. 3 knots is walking pace. It sounds harmless. Run it for 24 hours and it is 72 nautical miles. Run it for 6 days and it is more than 400. From where she started, 400 nautical miles east puts her on the French coast, and there is nothing in between. No island to fetch up on, no current to sweep her back out, no deep water parking. By the middle of that week, she was around 200 miles west of La Rochelle and still going. Every element of the trap is now visible at once. The funnel that pushed her into the bay, the prevailing westerly that decides her direction, the right-angled coast that guarantees she must hit something, and the shelf out ahead of her, waiting to steepen the sea as she gets closer, in the exact corner that the refraction has always aimed at. The response assembled fast, and it was serious. 2 contracted tugs, Centaurus and Ria Vigo, the French emergency towing vessel Abel Bourbon, out of Brest, doing the exact job the state keeps her for. The French Navy frigate Primo Gay, with a Lynx helicopter aboard, the anchor handler Argonaut, and a salvage team from the Dutch company Smite. They had one job: get a line onto her. That is a much harder job than it sounds, and the reason is that a drifting wreck cannot help you. There is nobody on the bow to take a messenger line. There is nobody to start a winch. The tow connection has to be made by putting human beings onto a ship that is lying at 40 degrees, unpowered, unlit, rolling in an open ocean swell, and having them work on a sloping steel deck with heavy wire. To do that, you need weather. And through the last days of January, in the Bay of Biscay, in winter, the weather refused. The salvors tried on the Friday. They could not board. They tried again on the Saturday. They could not board. Heavy weather kept them off, and each failed attempt burned a day of drift. 70-odd miles closer to a coast where she would go aground on a beach or a bar and start breaking up in the surf, on a shore where the summer economy is tourism and the winter economy is oysters. By Sunday, conditions were deteriorating further, and the arithmetic had become explicit. Monday was the last realistic opportunity. After that, there would not be enough water left between the ship and France to get a tow established and turn her. Watch the option disappear in real time. Every hour, the target gets closer to the shore, and the shore gets shallower, which means the sea over that ground gets steeper, which makes boarding harder, which makes the next attempt less likely to succeed. The bay narrows the window as the window matters more. That is the same mechanism that killed men in open boats in 1878, running at a different speed. Ashore, the preparation for failure had already started. The French Maritime Prefecture worked the problem the way you work a problem you expect to lose. Model the drift forward. Identify the likely landfall. Pre-position pollution response, and warn the departments. Drift modeling for a large unpowered vessel is not guesswork. You know her windage, you know her draft, you have the forecast wind and the surface current, and you can produce a cone of probable positions for each of the next several days. The cone for the modern Express pointed at the coast between the Gironde and the Landes. That coast is a long, straight, shallow, sandy shore with a heavy surf climate and no natural harbors worth the name between Arcachon and the Adour. A 164-meter ship arriving on it at 40 degrees of list, with 3,600 tons of unsecured timber and machinery on board and several hundred tons of fuel in her bunkers, would not have grounded gently. She would have hit the outer bar, stopped, and begun to break up in the surf, at which point the timber becomes floating debris across dozens of kilometers of beach, and the fuel becomes a shoreline problem in the middle of the oyster and tourism coast. There were no good alternatives available either. You cannot sink a ship like that on purpose in shallow water. You have only moved the wreck. You cannot lighten her without boarding her, and boarding her was the thing the weather was preventing. You cannot push her with a tug in a way that steers her, because pushing an unpowered 40-degree hull in a seaway simply rolls it. The only solution that existed was a line on the bow, and the line needed hands. So the question narrowed to one thing, and it stayed narrowed for 6 days. Could 4 people be put onto that deck for long enough to shackle on a wire? On Monday, 1st February, the weather gave them a gap. 4 Smith salvors went in by helicopter and were put down on the deck of a ship lying at 40 degrees. They connected the tow line. At 11:45 that morning, the line came tight, and the Modern Express was, for the first time in 6 days, under control. She was about 24 nautical miles from the French coast near Arcachon. 24 miles, at 3 knots, is 8 hours. The salvors were lifted off by a French Navy helicopter before the tow began, because a listing ship under tow is a ship that can capsize, and there was no reason for anyone to be standing on her when it happened. Then the last question of this whole story, the one the Erica could not ask, and the Prestige asked and was refused. Where do you take her? Spain said, Bilbao. That single decision is the difference between this incident and the one in 2002. A coastal state, with a listing ship full of oil and unsecured cargo coming toward it, agreed to accept the problem into a harbor. The convoy turned and began the slow haul southwest across the bay, at 2 to 3 knots, into Spanish waters, and by the following day she was under 30 nautical miles off Bilbao. She was brought in around 3 February. Getting her into Bilbao was not the end of it, and the port knew what it had accepted. A ship at 40 degrees alongside a quay is a ship that can still go over, and if she goes over in a harbor, she blocks it. The writing had to be done slowly and in the correct order, and the order is counterintuitive. You do not pull a listing ship upright, you make her float upright. The tool is water. A ship's ballast tanks are arranged in pairs along both sides, and each can be filled or emptied independently. By pumping out tanks on the low side and admitting water into tanks on the high side, in small increments, you shift the center of gravity across the ship a fraction at a time and let buoyancy do the work. Between each step, you wait, measure, and check that nothing aboard has moved, because the cargo that caused the list is still lying wherever it slid to, and it can slide again in the other direction as the deck angle changes. That process took about 3 weeks. 3 weeks of a ship sitting in a Spanish port, in flat water, with power on the quayside, engineers with drawings and no urgency at all, solving in slow motion the problem that had been unsolvable for 6 days at sea. She never went back into service in her old trade. She was sold on and eventually broken up on the beach at Aliyah in Turkey, which is where most ships of her generation end, cut apart by hand for scrap steel. Nobody died. Nothing was spilled. The French coast between Arcachon and the Adour saw nothing at all, and most of the people who live there have no idea how close it came, which is the correct outcome and also the reason this incident is far less famous than the ones that ended in oil. 9 days, from a cargo shift in the western approaches to a ship secured alongside in a Spanish port. 22 people, out in a single afternoon. One ship out in 8 days, most of which was spent waiting for weather. That is the whole system, running at once, and it tells you exactly what has changed and exactly what has not. Start with how much the knowing improved, because it is genuinely remarkable, and it deserves credit before the caveat. A modern ship carries an emergency position indicating beacon that floats free if she sinks, switches itself on when it gets wet, and transmits to a network of satellites that fixes it and passes the identity and position to the responsible rescue center. The identity is registered, so the center knows the ship's name, her size, her owner, and how many people should be aboard before anyone has spoken to anybody. On top of that sits satellite voice and data, digital selective calling on the radio, and the transponder track that has been recording where she has been for the last several days. In 1870, the Royal Navy learned it had lost a battleship because 18 men walked into a Spanish town. In 2016, the loss of control aboard the Modern Express was a known fact, with a name and a position in a British rescue center within minutes. Coast Guards in 3 countries had her drift modeled forward for days. which is why they knew on the Sunday that Monday was the last day she could be reached. Knowing has gone from days to seconds. Arriving has not moved at all. A search and rescue helicopter has a radius of action set by fuel, and hovering burns fuel faster than flying. Every mile further out is a mile out and a mile back and less time on scene in the middle. At 150 miles, the aircraft is doing arithmetic before it lifts. And the arithmetic decides how many people it can take in one go, which is why 2 aircraft were needed for 22 people and why they landed at 2 different airports. A tug's transit time is a function of horsepower against sea state. And the sea state that caused the emergency is the same sea state slowing the tug. A salvage team's ability to work is a function of what a human being can physically do on a wet, sloping deck in wind, which has not improved since the 19th century and will not. The emergency tugs help, and they exist because of these disasters. But there is a limited number of them, and they are stationed at specific points. The Abel Bourbon at Brest, for the Ushant Gate, others at other choke points, which means that a ship in the middle of the bay is by definition a long way from the tug. Stationing is a compromise with geography, not a solution to it, and the industry the whole system serves has moved in the opposite direction. Vessels are larger, so a single failure now involves more steel, more fuel, and more cargo. Manning has fallen. A ship that would have carried 35 or 40 people 2 generations ago is worked by 20 or fewer, on watch patterns that regulators have repeatedly identified as producing fatigue. There is more traffic through the same lanes. Voyage schedules are tighter, and the tightness is enforced by contracts written a long way from any wheelhouse. So the modern picture is not that technology failed. It is that technology upgraded the first half of every emergency and left the second half alone, and the gap between those 2 halves is exactly where this bay does its work. Every one of the improvements in this story was real. Decked boats and weather bulletins after 1878, stability standards after 1870, traffic separation after 1978, double hulls, port state control, and a European agency after 1999. Places of refuge rules after 2002, coastal flood warnings, and demolished houses after 2010. None of them was cosmetic. All of them saved lives that would otherwise have been lost, and each of them changed the terms of the exposure rather than removing it, because the underlying incentive never changed. This is the shortest way south, and time is money. There is one more thing that has to be said carefully, because it is easy to say badly. It would be convenient to end by claiming the bay is getting stormier. The honest position is that North Atlantic storm track behavior and long-term wave height trends are actively studied and genuinely contested, that the observational records are short and the natural variability is large, and that no responsible reading of the evidence supports telling you the Bay of Biscay is measurably more violent now than it was 50 years ago. What is not contested is sea level. A surge arrives on top of whatever the mean sea level happens to be, and mean sea level is rising. The same 1.5 meter surge on the same spring tide reaches a little further up the same dike every decade. That is the mechanism Xynthia exposed, and it is the one that does not need a change in storminess to get worse. As for the Galerna, the question left open on Easter Saturday in 1878, the answer now is better and still not good enough. Coastally trapped disturbances on the Cantabrian coast are recognized, modeled, and tracked. Forecasters can identify a day with Galerna potential and can watch one propagate east along the coast in near real time. The lead time for a specific place is still measured in tens of minutes, because the phenomenon itself is a narrow front moving fast along a mountain wall. A warning that arrives 40 minutes ahead is a genuine improvement over no warning. It is not the same thing as safety, and every skipper on that coast still has to decide what a beautiful, windless, fishless morning in July is telling him. which brings the corner back one last time. Everything in this story arrives at the same place. The swell that crosses 3,000 miles of Atlantic feels the shelf, bends, and steepens into the southeast angle. The oil from the Erica, which took 11 days to come out of the sea and did it on Christmas week. The oil from the Prestige, which was towed 250 kilometers offshore and reached Galicia, then Cantabria, then the Basque Country, then France anyway. The water that Xynthia stacked onto the Vendée. The Luno, put onto a breakwater by an overheating sensor. The Modern Express, drifting for 6 days at walking pace, aimed the whole time at a stretch of French coast between Arcachon and the Landes. It is not coincidence, and it is not bad luck. It is the shape of the box, a funnel open only to the west, a shelf that concentrates the energy, and a right-angled coast downwind of everything. Whatever loses power inside that box goes to the same place, on a schedule you can calculate, and the only variable is whether anyone gets there first. Go and stand on the Cavalier's breakwater at Anglet on an ordinary afternoon. It has been repaired. The concrete blocks at the head are newer than the rest. There will be surfers in the water on the north side and people walking dogs, and the Adour coming out brown between the jetties. It is a completely unremarkable piece of European coastline. A few miles offshore, the seabed under those surfers falls into the Cap Breton Canyon and keeps falling. On a screen in a traffic control room up the coast, the ships crossing tonight are moving south in their lane, one after another, the way they do every night. The same water, the same shelf, the same corner sitting quietly downwind of all of them.